Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Internet Management Committee in Brazil, CGBR, and the NIC.br, we would like to welcome you all and thank you for being here this morning to the 9th Seminar on Personal Data Privacy Protection. We would like to thank all of those who are following us online. And before we open, we would like to show you two one-minute videos. They briefly explain what CGI and NIC.br are and our research centers. Eu não tenho, Armando, na cabine. I'm sorry, we don't have this audio in the booth. I apologize. Privacy, neutrality, network neutrality are absolutely key to Internet. And these are the 10 principles that have been created by Internet CGI.br. It has been promoting Internet in Brazil. There is constant innovation, Internet security, and guidelines for development. This is all part of a collaborative, transparent, and democratic process. Our committee has representatives of all members of society, representing the different paths of society. There is a constant dialogue and participation of all members until we reach a consensus. This is why our model of governance has become a reference all over the world. CGI.br for better Internet in Brazil. When you register a .br domain, you are contributing to improving Internet, because if you use .br, it is registered by NIC.br, our Center of Information and Coordination of .br. So we have registration of domain names, and we also deal with security incidents. We have projects of network. We run surveys talking about information and communication, implementation of IX.br, projects that contribute to the development of web, and a lot more. All of that because NIC.br is a private, not-for-profit organization which has a domain registration structure which is very reliable. And part of what you pay for your domain is invested in infrastructure, benefiting everyone who uses Internet in Brazil. Innovation, state-of-the-art technology, infrastructure, and security is possible because you have a domain, always focusing on the best to our Internet in Brazil. Detailed information about all our actions can be accessed in our websites. To open our morning session, I would like to invite for the opening panel all the representatives of the agencies involved in organizing this seminar. So we have the public office, the Public Prosecutor's Office, and we have here Luis Costa, Research and Teaching Center of Law School, Fundação Getúlio Vargas, represented by Marina Pfefferbaum, ISOC Internet Society, here represented by Raquel Gatto. We would also like to invite Demi Getchko, who is chairman of NIC.br, who is the moderator of our panel. Demi is also a board member of CGI.br. I would like to apologize on behalf of our coordinator, Maximiliano Martinho, who unfortunately could not be here this morning. We're going to show you a video with his message, and we are going to show you shortly. Finally, we would like to invite Congressman Orlando Silva, who is the creator of the bill on data privacy and protection. Now I would like to hand it over to Demi, who's going to carry on. Good morning, everyone. We are all very glad to be here for the 8th time. This is the 9th version of the seminar on data protection. We started in 2010. And there are some who have been with me, Luis Costa, Raquel, IX.br. So we have been continuously working together. And the main purpose has always been to reach a protection of internet user, protecting the privacy of our users. And it's wonderful now to have the great support of Congressman Orlando Silva. So now there is a bill which has already been submitted for voting, and it's under scrutiny and decision before its final vote in the Congress. So now we really have to start working on more concrete issues. Said that, I think the videos have already brought our initial remarks. I think in Brazil we have a wonderful model of governance for internet. So we have .br domain registry to help us work on other initiatives, such as the seminar. Two international internet governance forums were held thanks to the investments we have from .domain and a number of other initiatives such as broadband and others. So I think that it has been very successfully structured in Brazil. All domains are equally good in internet, but .br, we don't have shareholders, and as a consequence, all the resources are reinvested in the internet, really making investments in things that are of interest to the internet community. I think it's a very good model that should be maintained as is. I just bumped into someone when I was coming, and I have already this example, because we have a tendency to be somewhat critical in our comments. And there is a book by Chesterton, beginning of last century. So what's wrong in the world? And he points out a number of things which are wrong, but among his points, which is a wrong mistake, so to speak, is that sometimes we don't realize what is actually correct. So in an attempt to correct what's wrong, we end up discarding things which are good, which are correct. There are many wrong things in the world, but it's not everything. Said that, trying to separate what's right from what's wrong is absolutely essential so that we can preserve, maintain continuity of the good things. So let me now hand it over to my panel members and wish you all a very good seminar. I would like to start by asking Luis Costa to speak first. He's been one of the inspirers, forces of this seminar. He said, why don't we do something to really deal and protect data privacy? So it was brought to the attention of the committee, and then we started organizing the seminar. So thank you very much, Luis, for being here with us. Thank you, Demi. I'm very glad to be here once again It's the 9th seminar, yes, 9th seminar. I would like to start by greeting all panel members, all sponsors and supporters of this event. It's wonderful to see that we have consistently built a solid foundation bringing us to a very interesting moment of discussion and reflection. So thank for all supporters of this seminar. We can see in our agenda a number of interesting topics with discussions involving comparison with European Union, U.S. model, some criminal issues, the role of private sector, artificial intelligence, creation of profiles, the impact of profiling, data leak, and privacy and protection of personal data and technology. It is a result of all the different aspects that data protection and handling really brings to the surface. I would like to remind you that we are here not only to talk about mechanical formal operations when we talk about data handlings or database storage. We really have to realize that this kind of activity is part of a broader understanding. It is very much related to economic activity, political activities, how the government uses data, how companies use data. And ultimately, how can we protect people, and of course, considering all the legal issues, really trying to understand within a much broader context of dealing with personal data. I would like to briefly address the moment that we are currently living in, which is the approval of the bill about data protection. The first regulations and laws date back from the 70s. So fair information practice in the US and other laws and regulations approved in Europe. Sometimes we look up to Europe, sometimes we look up to the US, maybe we could look up to Latin America, but anyway, thinking about those two more traditional models in the area, we are like 50 years lagging behind. So we are really lagging behind compared to what they already have in place. However, I don't want to find who is to be blamed for it, but it rather shows how long it has taken us to get to this point. It's a fact. In the models from the 70s that have been constantly upgraded, models on which we base our bill, there are three main pillars. One, principles and rights safeguards. Second, rules of responsibilities. And third, a guaranteeing authority or an assuring authority. So these are the three pillars. I'm not going to go into details, but I don't think we can have data protection unless we have all the three elements: independent authority with principles and really assuring the enforcement of rights so that we can really have them put in place. I don't think we can make do without fundamental rights. We really need all the elements and pillars. We should always maintain the key focus. And, of course, always rely on what is successful and already in place. So thank you very much. I wish you very fruitful discussions throughout the next 2 days to Brazil as a member of an international community. Thank you. Let me now ask Marina Pfefferball with Law School at FGV. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here once again. Our Center of Study has contributed to building this initiative. Working with Alexandre Pacheco, who could not be here today, but I've noticed how much this seminar has expanded. It has become international, and it's a reference for our whole internet community in terms of data protection and all topics related to internet. As a research center, we are very proud of our partnership. It's an inspiration as a teaching organization. There is a trend of having specific subjects like digital law. But as you can see, all topics are emerging, are a request of the society, and it involves human rights, contract law, intellectual property. So we get inspiration from initiatives such as this seminar to think how to create the best syllabus in our courses so that all the different subjects can really be or can really encompass the current reality, rethinking law, the role of students in law school as agents of society, especially during a moment in which we address key issues for internet. As research center, once again, I'm very proud to be here with highly qualified speakers, interested parties. So I wish you great seminar, and thank you very much for the invitation. Raquel Gatto, when it all started, she worked at NIC.br. She worked with us. Then she started working for Internet Society, ISOC, which is a not-for-profit organization, which is an important agency for different Internet activities. So, Raquel? Thank you, Demi. It's always wonderful to come back home and be here this morning with all of you. I'm so happy and proud to see how the seminar has really expanded. And I am going to show you 3 points here just to kick off our seminar. First of all, the history. When the seminar started, we just had a draft of a possible bill to be submitted to the Congress on data protection. Together with Danilo Doneda, Marcel Leonardi, and a number of others, we worked on preparing a workshop to present the draft bill and then organizing the seminar, because we thought it would be necessary to know more about data protection models, their importance, defining the best way to do it. And I say that because I'm sure Congressman Orlando Silva and others will emphasize that. But after almost 10 years, This discussion is happening in our community, involving different agencies, and finally we have a bill and an approved law. And now we are just waiting for final sanction and enforcement. We really want the entire process to be logical, protecting people and protecting their data. This is something fundamental, not only because we are thinking about fundamental rights, human rights, but also making sure that the process that relied on public hearings, involvement of different agents done online, through formal public hearings, even during seminars, addressing all the scope of the regulation. So we want it to be maintained as is. How can we guarantee the completion of such a long process, which is ultimately the completion of one single step? Having a law is the beginning of a new cycle. And certainly, we haven't done everything that still has to be done to really make sure that we have data protection in Brazil. Secondly, data protection law is not only for internet processes or the online world, so to speak. It also applies to some offline processes. But in digital economy, we tend to see the greater impact and the greater need for having this data protection provided. There is some incentive, some encouragement to have data collection, data use in digital economy. Let me give you some examples of how things work. There are apps, devices, sensors that collect data. Data are stored and organized within another technology, which is big data. So we have Internet of Things, all the different sensors and apps. Of course, being very simplistic, we have storage and organization within big data. And finally, the analysis and intelligent use of data, which is artificial intelligence focused on machine learning. So all the new technologies and new uses require data. Data is the fuel for all these processes, and it's fine. It's part of innovation. It's part of all the economic growth that we expect to achieve. The problem is how users are to be back into the equation. Regardless of the legal framework that we are alluding to, and all the digital environment should have always 4 dimensions: users, dimension of new technologies, networks. So internet is a communication network through which data will flow, and multi-sector collaborative processes, so that all areas can be heard and have a voice in decision-making processes that involve data. I can see my time's almost up. I would like to say that it's quite easy, based on news and vulnerabilities that we hear all the time, it's very easy to simply put the blame on internet or technology, but that's not true. Use or abuse of data do not result from technology. And now, advocating for internet was built based on some principles and attributes in internet society. We try to call them internet variables, but there are some attributes and features which are absolutely intrinsic to internet. As we need to encourage regulation, we may end up breaking down with internet. Rather than encouraging, we may lead it to a problem, to an end. So internet, network of networks, this universal global characteristic, the fact that we have a decentralized chain, no central authority, permissionless innovation, which does not mean anarchy. It does not mean that it is a world without laws. But to join internet, there is no need for a central authority. Therefore, these are my remarks, and I wish you all great journey, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, and let me congratulate all the organizers. Thank you very much. Let me now hand it over to Congressman Orlando Silva.
Thank you, Demi. I'd like to greet Raquel, Marina, my fellow panel members. I wanted to be here this morning for the 9th edition of the seminar to say thank you, because the Governance Committee, CGI, was one of the main players in the process of taking a step forward in voting the Brazilian legislation, which, as you know, is on the verge of being approved by the president. I remember having been here in August 2016, on the very day that the House Speaker had put together a special committee for this, and I was the rapporteur for that commission. And that's when the voting process started for this bill. At the time, it was linked by the PL number 46, which was very much influenced by another bill, which was, as it was said here before, the result of a long and hard work. 1 year later, in 2017, after a lot of political problems or issues in the Brazilian life, I realized we hadn't advanced as much as we would have liked to. But then until the end of last year, we realized we could at least put together a text which could be assessed by Congress. Fortunately, we managed to put together a text, but there was no consensus around that text. But then, inspired by the model chosen by this committee, we managed to go through a final phase where there was intense interaction, intense collective work. So I'd like to publicly thank the committee for its input and collaboration. Several economic agents were also present. Representatives from different federal government agencies also participated. So around a very specific panel we were fortunate enough to be able to conclude the text, which was put to vote. And as I was saying to Marina just now, and all that happened in 2018, a very, very difficult year for Brazilian politics, and we managed to approve it unanimously. That's very, very rare. The Brazilian political spectrum is very wide, with very distinct opinions. There is a institutional crisis in Brazil, as you know very well, but still, the text was speedily approved at the House of Representatives and then at the Senate level. And this happened, I believe, because this process was quite the result of a collective effort where we had a high level of tolerance from all players, all participating agents. And our challenge now is to take that text to the executive level to be approved. And that will require from us the same level of tolerance that we have shown and exercised so far. No economic sector, I repeat, can publicly say that it was not heard for this. All topics were offered to debate and taken into consideration. So no economic sector might argue that it was not heard. We hear here and there that lobbies have been conducted to veto a series of items in the approved text, which would mean a certain rupture with this pact which was put together when the text was first voted. The text does not reflect, of course, each specific sector. It is a collective work. Many people ask me, what will happen now? Will the text be fully approved? And my answer is yes. I am quite optimistic that we will have the presidential approved of the full text. Because, first of all, it was voted unanimously at the House and at the Senate. Number two, because of the strength of a text which was put together collectively. By this point, there is no single author of the text. It is a collective work, as I said. Many different brains, if you will, participated in putting the text together. And number three, on top of all that, I dare say that this was the law which was put together in the most interesting collective effort in our history. We are very diversified, very different, very distinct parties involved, but we are together around the same idea. And this idea is summarized in the text of the new bill. So I'm very happy and very optimistic in saying that we expect this text, this bill, to be approved by the President fully. There are topics which are quite sensitive. I agree with what was said. When we lack an ensuring authority, we also lose efficacy of the bill. I agree with our colleague here. And one Supreme Court justice has said that at the final stretch of putting together the law, we heard the House Speaker, we also heard the House's legal counsel, and the most experienced congressmen, and they all said that we could expect the text to be voted and then to create the ensuring authority, and then at the final stage, the approval by the President would remove any chance of a legal challenge going forward. So the inclusion of different state governments is important. State governments deal with a lot of data. The inclusion of state governments is fundamental. It makes no sense to exclude the participation of state governments. They need to be included. And we've seen, of course, as I said, attempts to veto parts of the text. But those doubts, those questions are valid. We're talking about a new, sensitive topic. But as I said, the level of tolerance we have exercised will be key for us to reach a very consistent document at the end of the road. And we, as I said, are expecting to see the efficacy of the GDPR. And today we have a full acceptance of that. If I talked about the crisis in Brazil, we also need to talk about the economic crisis. Brazil needs to become an important platform, and that includes the export of services. And that law will provide the necessary legal security for that, so that we can also advance on that front. So again, thank you, Demi, for your collaboration, the CGI, and there are several people here in the room. I'd like to thank you all for collaborating in our collective effort in producing this final document. Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. This has been a very straightforward opening panel. I'd like to remind you that Maximilian Martinho, who is the CGI coordinator, could not be here today, but he sent us a video. The video will be shown in a moment. It's a short video. So we're going to see the video. Thank you, everyone, for your attention so far.
Nós tivemos pequeno
We had a small technical glitch with the video. We are addressing that now, so we'll move straight to the next activity, which will be the speaker from Bruno Gicarelli, the DG of Justice and Consumers, and International Data Flow from the European Union, who will be talking about the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. Diego Canabara, our assistant, will conduct the activity. After the presentation, we will show the video we had meant to show now. Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me? Good morning, everyone. I am Diego Canabara from the committee's advisory committee. I am here substituting Max, who would be here today. So I'm here on his behalf to introduce Mr. Giancarelli. You probably read Bruno's autobiography. He today heads the international unit responsible for data flows and protection at the European Union or Commission within the Public Policy Directorate concerning justice, consumer rights, and gender equality within the European Commission. He also led the delegation of the European Commission and community processes that led to the creation of the framework for data, personal data, and he worked with the Parliament, European Parliament, and with the Council, European Council, in the definition of a new regulation for data protection, personal data protection for the European Union. Bruno is a big leader in negotiations with other countries which have tried to put together data flow among European countries, most notably with other countries, most notably Japan and the US. And he has a long journey in the legal area and also in political science. So it's nice to hear that, Bruno, because I thought I was one of the few crazy guys who had studied both areas. And in practice, he has a very intense intellectual production in the data protection front. So this first keynote could be about the general law of data protection in Brazil and everything which has been happening for the past months as it concerns the final stages of our law, as you just heard in the first panel. But the seminar committee or organizing committee chose to talk about the general data protection issue for the European Union because it has served as a framework for all other countries which want to think about local data protection activities. And you probably all know about the repercussion of the adoption of the GDPR in the media, and you are probably aware of the main issues around that from a technical standpoint all the way through more broad issues such as the impact of the GDPR to international trade and other areas. So we invited Bruno so he could give us this broad overview of the subject. So Bruno, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me first thank CGI for inviting me to this seminar and say how pleased and honored I'm to be with you today. This seminar could not have taken place at a more appropriate moment. We've just heard why. Brazil is the place to be in these days, in this week, in this month. And without exaggerating, these are truly historical times for data protection in both Brazil and the EU. And I will try to focus my remarks on that convergence and on the potential and the opportunities of such convergence. This is an area where we already have a lot of common ground, we, Brazil and the EU. We share common values, as notably reflected in our respective constitutional framework, shared values, but also common opportunities, and we've just heard about that. Brazil and the EU both want to fully seize the opportunities of the digital economy, and at the risk of stating the obvious, data plays in that context a fundamental role as a key resource, a key enabler, a key driver of growth, innovation, trade. This is, by the way, increasingly reflected in the cooperation between EU and Brazil in a wide range of issues, from agriculture to smart cities, from research to ICT, to name a few. And to fully unleash the potential of the digital economy, we also need modern, credible, balanced rules of the game when it comes to what can be done with data. This is what our citizens deserve in the EU and in Brazil, and this is also what business needs and asks for, rules of the game. In that respect, it is interesting to see the various calls from many sectors of the Brazilian society, including many sections of the business community, for the quick enactment of the law that has just been mentioned. It was also for us, as you said, I've led the delegation of the Commission in the negotiation of the GDPR. I would have loved to have a unanimous parliament. I think that you had a unanimous vote represent how much this answers and responds to various needs felt in the Brazilian society. Finally, the EU and Brazil also face common challenges in this area. Recent scandals, revelations, such as, amongst others, Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, have been a wake-up call. They have reminded us of why it is so important to protect privacy, not only at the level of the individual as a central individual right, but also at the level of the society, as the society taken as a whole, for the preservation of other freedoms, other fundamental freedoms, and ultimately for the functioning of a democracy and the integrity of electoral processes. We have important elections this year in Brazil and in the EU. In other words, we realize how much is at stake from a human rights point of view, as a democratic imperative, but also as an economic necessity. Without consumer trusts in the way their data is handled, there can be no sustainable growth of our increasingly data-driven economy. Rarely has this been clearer than at the present moment. And in a world which is too often characterized by uncertainty and unpredictability, it is very positive and promising that Brazil and the EU are increasingly developing converging responses to these opportunities and challenges. Brazil and the EU, and also together with an increasing number of countries in other regions of the world, as reflected, for instance, and the next panel will deal with that, in the increasingly universal membership of Convention 108 of the Council of Europe. So, before touching upon some of the benefit of this type of convergence, I would like to briefly address some of the key elements, I would say some of the key, some of the building blocks. A previous speaker has spoken about pillars. Some of the pillars of a modern data protection legislation that balances the respect for privacy with the legitimate needs of business operator. And maybe also say something of our experience with these elements, in the context of the GDPR. I will mention 5 of such elements. 3 pillars, 5 building blocks. First of all, the need for, and Boyana, how many of them you have? 7, so it's a crescendo. First of all, the need for a comprehensive legislation, a comprehensive set of rules that apply across the board rather than sectoral rules. At a time when data is increasingly shared across industries, across business models, but also between the public and the private sector. Let's think about health, let's think about research, let's think about smart cities, which is dominated by public-private partnership in a certain sense. So at a time where we need data to move across sectors, across industry, across business model, we need common rules of the game. In any legislative process, and we saw that very well in the EU during the GDPR negotiation, unfortunately, there are always demands at some point of the process for special rules, specific sectoral rules, sectoral carve-outs, sectoral exclusions. Each sector thinks it is so specific that it needs to be taken care of by special rules. That doesn't really make sense in the digital world. Only a horizontal framework, a framework which is sector and technological neutral, can ensure a level playing field that can deliver both trust and legal certainty, where data can move easily and a level of protection can be guaranteed, a consistent level of protection can be guaranteed to individuals. This is also important at international level. If we want to further develop cooperation, exchange of data, not only in the commercial sphere, but also in the area of regulatory or law enforcement cooperation, where we need also on both sides public authorities to comply with some basic fundamental data protection principles. So first element, an overarching framework. Second element, rather than through regulatory silos, which actually create additional costs and obstacles to the movement of data, the broad variety of processing operations that characterize the digital economy should instead be addressed through different legal tools, or to speak the data protection lingo, through different legal grounds, through different legal bases, on which different legal bases on which you can rely to collect and process data. That's the second element. But data need not only consent, but also, for example, processing data which is necessary for the performance of a contract, processing data for reason of public interest, processing data for the legitimate interest of the business operator. That's a legal grounds mix, if I can call it like this, that you can find in both the GDPR and the Brazilian legislation, which is currently under consideration for final approval for enactment. This has been discussed at length in the context of the GDPR negotiation. And our experience is that if you can get that mix right, and that mix made up of sufficiently different and diverse tools, then you can take care of a very broad range of processing operation. To mention just 2 examples, from processing in the public sector for some public services to processing in the financial sector for purpose, for instance, of fighting against fraud. You can do this without the need for sectoral legal grounds, without the need for legal basis. And that, again, is a source, it's a source of clarity of the law, therefore of legal certainty, legal clarity, legal security. It's a source of also trust for users, and it ensures that level playing field. Similar consideration applied, by the way, in the area of international transfers. As the GDPR and the bill adopted by the Brazilian Congress shows, it is highly desirable and it is perfectly possible to combine a high level of protection on the one hand with openness for international data flows. through, again, different tools. To name a few, from consent to contractual clauses or adequacy decisions or other tools that you find. You have a long list in the GDPR. You have a quite similar list in the Brazilian bills. It's very important to stress that actually one, high standards of data protection can contribute to the other, trade exchange of data. Those are not mutually exclusive objectives. Respecting privacy is increasingly a condition for stable, secure, and competitive commercial data flows. Third elements, individuals, and that has already also been mentioned, individual needs to have control over the data. They should be data subject rather than data object. This is, of course, very much linked to the trust dimension of all this. This requires that individuals are clearly informed about what happens to their data, who is processing your data, what data is processed, and for which purpose, including in case information, including in case when data can be stolen or lost, data breach, as these incidents can have very harmful consequences, identity thefts, fraud, etc. This also requires that individuals benefit from a clear set of enforceable rights to effectively exercise such control. These privacy rights range from the most traditional ones, access, rectification, deletion, to those addressing specific challenges of the information society, such as, for example, the right for individuals in certain situations and when important decisions affecting them are taken by automated means, basically algorithms, to be informed about the underlying decision logic and to have the possibility to obtain human intervention, to ask the decision to be reviewed, to take into account some elements that an algorithm may not necessarily have sufficiently taken into consideration. These are not obstacles, as I often hear, to artificial intelligence or other important developments. But this is simply about ensuring that these developments lead to fair results and to avoid discrimination. Nobody here wants to create obstacles, but empower the individuals with the tools that will reassure him or her when sharing his or her data. It's true for Brazil, it's true for the EU, it's true for almost every country in the world. What is the first concern of individuals when they, for instance, shop online? Security and security of the data and privacy. Fourth element, a system based on accountability, coupled with credible enforcement in case of non-compliance, rather than a system based on bureaucratic requirements through, for instance, the need for prior notification or prior authorization, which are burdensome and may delay the offer of goods and services. In that context, bottom-up core regulatory tools such as codes of conduct, certification schemes, can be introduced to support companies in developing their compliance policies and demonstrate when needed and also demonstrate and help the companies demonstrating compliance vis-à-vis the supervisory authorities when needed. And that's, for instance, an area where I think we will see increasing cooperation at international level to develop those codes of conduct, those certification regimes, and help companies navigate between these different regimes. Last, but certainly not the least, in the EU, as well as in many other countries around the world, in the EU experience, the effective implementation of privacy rules depends to a large extent on oversight and enforcement by an independent supervisory authority, an independent data protection authority. I understand that this issue is at the very core of the current discussions in Brazil, the current debate, and this is, of course, a choice that has to be made. I won't enter into this domestic discussion, but I just want to share with you our experience in the EU and why we believe this is an essential part of a modern and effective privacy regime. For at least three reasons. First, it is important for citizens, for the sake of citizens, to ensure that they have an accessible, point of contact to answer their queries and handle their complaints without having to go through lengthy and costly court proceedings. This is especially important in the area of privacy, where a lot of queries and complaints are about quite limited, routine, mundane issues, if you want, access, rectification to data. And it's very good in that context to have an independent authority that can act as intermediary between individuals and businesses, and very often help finding appropriate solution outside the confrontational context of a courtroom. It's good for the individual, it's good also for business. Second aspect which is very beneficial to, I would say, legal certainty and having clear rules of the games in place. When it comes to ensuring compliance with the law, data protection authorities or agencies, unlike courts that, of course, look at case on an individual basis, if they come or they don't come, and in a decentralized manner, a data protection authority can ensure consistent enforcement across cases, across the country. This is important to avoid fragmentation in the interpretation. Also, data protection agencies typically have a broader and more flexible toolbox when compared with courts, as they can use both soft instruments, advice, recommendation, warnings, orders, injunctions, or, when necessary, also sanctions, including financial sanctions when needed and when justified in light of the circumstance of the cases. But that I would say that toolbox, that broad toolbox, is very important to ensure credible enforcement, but also proportionate enforcement that, again, takes care of the circumstances of each cases, and which is much broader than what a court normally has. Third, and probably the most important element and added value of such an agency is that data protection legislation, by definition, has to stay at a certain level of generality. And there's always need for further guidance to ensure uniform interpretation and application, but also to adapt the implementation of the rules to fast-evolving technological and economic condition. As I said before, it's important that the legislation remains technologically neutral, but as we know, we are in a world, especially in this area, which evolves very quickly, and where you might have a gap between the law and its interpretation and its application. Having a well-equipped and independent, because independent is also part of legitimacy, authority can help there by developing general guidance instead of having to rule on each and every case, develop a general interpretation, ensure legal certainty, and at the same time adaptability to a changing environment. And that's what we have seen in the EU. In the context of the implementation of the GDPR, contrary to what some predicted, Data Protection Authority did not transform themselves in a sort of fining, sanctioning machines. Instead, they have, if I may say, rolled up their sleeves, engaged with stakeholders in Europe and also outside Europe, actually, and notably issued guidelines on all novel aspects of the GDPR, following wide public consultation. This is certainly the approach, the supervision culture that we in the European Union and at the European Commission certainly want to promote. Compliance with data protection rules, and I know there are concerns, does not happen in one day, overnight. It's a dynamic process, and a dialogue with an independent, well-equipped, well-resourced data protection authority is a key part of that process. So yes, certainly the creation of an authority, an agency, is an investment. But in Europe, we believe, if I can put it in those terms, that it's public money well spent. As not having such an authority can involve, down the road, significant risks and costs in terms of fragmentation in the interpretation of the rules, legal uncertainty, rigidity, overall rigidity of the system, compliance costs, etc. I could probably go on and on, including by mentioning how modern privacy laws can contribute to innovation, incentivize the development of privacy and data security enhancing technologies through, for instance, a risk-based approach. But ladies and gentlemen, let me come to a close. Of course, in privacy, like in many other areas one can think of, there is no one-size-fits-all approach or model. And it is for each country to design its own data protection system adapted to its own needs, policy choices, conditions, and legal tradition. But the fact that Brazil is participating actively to this clear trend towards global convergence is a very significant and extremely positive development. First of all, I believe for Brazil itself, for the protection of its citizens, for helping its companies to navigate better between different systems, cutting compliance costs, and enhancing Brazil integration in the global data-driven economy. Also, at a time when there is an increasing need for international standard in this area, a global player like Brazil could play a leading role in Latin America and beyond in the shaping of such standards. Very good news, for instance, that we have heard that Brazil is considering becoming observer and I hope member to Convention 108 of the Council of Europe. The voice of Brazil had in related areas, had played a leading role in the past. We all remember Marco Civil. I think the voice of Brazil is expected on these issues. As European Union, and this will be my very last words, as European Union, we certainly very much welcome these developments. Brazil is one of our most important partners. Politically, economically, we are the second trading partner of Brazil. We are the first foreign investor in Brazil, but also culturally. We believe we could further develop our cooperation in this area. Regulatory convergence through, for instance, the adoption of the law which is under consideration could significantly facilitate data flows and, for instance, complement the free trade agreement we are currently negotiating with Brazil in the context of Mercosur. We can further build on the convergence such a law would bring, including through a so-called adequacy decision by the European Union, which would ensure the free and unhindered flow of data between the EU and Brazil. An adequacy decision is a decision that assimilates a third country, like in this case Brazil, to a member country of the EU and ensures that data can move from the EU to that third country as it moves within the EU between, I don't know, Italy and France, France and Germany. It is a way to unleash the potential of data flows without subjecting them to any additional safeguards or condition. We have just, and you recall it, we have just concluded that deal, similar arrangement with Japan, creating, by the way, the biggest area of free and safe data flows in the world. This is something we certainly want to explore with Brazil. So, as you can see, we can and we should be ambitious in this area. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bruno, obrigado pela generosidade dupla.
Thank you very much for being extremely generous. First, for dealing so beautifully with time and giving us some more minutes for discussions. And secondly, for bringing to us a very precise, concise summary of a personal data privacy law. And I think that this is really important and will serve as a foundation for our future sessions of work here in the seminar. Before opening to questions, I would like to make two comments one about convergency of Brazil and European Union. For us that work with internet governance, this is really important, and it's related with the World Summit for confirmation, when Professor Rodota just brought us to a side and started working in a statement of principles, a bill of principles, fundamental principles for governability of internet in the world, which has led to our 10 principles at CGI, and indirectly influenced all the legal framework that we have now with the Marco Civil of Internet in Brazil. There was also Edward Snowden disclosures, which brought European countries and Brazil addressing privacy of data, bringing it to the UN, and later Brazil hosted the NET meeting here in Brazil, where personal data privacy was one of the key topics. I think that convergency and harmonization concerning regulation or rules and laws. Said all that, I would like to know if there are questions from the audience or comments, so that we can keep on hearing Bruno. So we have microphones. There is someone on the back. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, say your name and your organization, something about you very briefly, so that Bruno can be contextualized. Good morning. My name is Andrea Villamy. I am a DPO and I work in Europe as well. And I would like to know about Brazil's position concerning a framework of data transfer. What are your thoughts about it? Let me now ask for the second question. Let's gather some questions, Bruno, and then we have them all answered. Would that be okay for you? My name is Aristides. I am a lawyer, and similar to what we have just heard, with the new legislation, will Brazil fit? Because only Argentina in South America is part of that. Can we follow the same line for data transfer with European Union countries?
Temos mais alguma pergunta?
I have one here. United Health Group. I have a question regarding the training of personnel, because I think it's a big challenge as well. So what we are doing for structuring a curriculum for bringing the professionals to support companies and public sector into complying with such a law.
Eu vou encerrar aqui essa rodada de
Let me now ask Bruno to answer those 3 questions, and then we can open for further questions. And he is just repeating the question that has been asked to you in English about training of different players, just to make sure that Brazilian players can really comply with the European rules. So how can we really update the curriculum of our teaching organizations and all that? Whenever you ask a question in English, please let us know, right? Because we have all the 2 languages. Or maybe you can ask your questions in Portuguese, because we have a translation booth.
I think I've better understood the question in Portuguese than in English, but that was maybe because of the audio. On data transfer, well, we certainly consider that the adoption of this legislation, again, it's not for me to enter into a domestic debate. I'm not Brazilian, nobody is perfect. But looking at this from the outside, this is a legislation which is extremely interesting because it presents a number of points, and some of them I've mentioned, of points of convergence, of commonality, that indeed for us would be the basis to work on a so-called adequacy decision, and therefore ensure the free flow of data between the EU and Brazil, and I hope between Brazil and the EU, and have the sort of similar deal we just conclude with Japan. Of course, the existence of a independent data protection agency authority would be absolutely central and crucial to build that convergence. We are, and I'm saying this today, but this is something that we had 2 years ago. The Commission had defined what would be its strategy in terms of data flows. We had adopted the GDPR, and we said, well, now we need to focus more on the international dimension. And we had mentioned Brazil as one of the few priority countries we wanted to focus on and to work with, because we could see that this convergence was coming, but also because of the importance of our relationship, trade, economic, cultural, political, and because indeed we are also negotiating a free trade agreement, and the two could create very important and interesting synergies, as trade, of course, relies increasingly on data flows. So we would welcome very much the adoption of this law, and we would, and I've said this to the Brazilian authorities so they know that we would immediately start working with Brazil in reaching such an objective. Somebody mentioned other countries in Latin America. Yes, this is also very interesting, because we see that this need for convergence is, of course, important for the relationship between the EU and Latin America, but it is also something which is felt at regional level, where, and some very important standards were adopted last year, the Ibero-American standards, that show that, again, this is not about photocopying one model or the other, that through the local domestic needs, legal tradition instrument, one can develop a modern data protection legislation. And we've seen Argentina and Uruguay actually have, is the other country have been mentioned, but we've seen, for instance, in Chile, Chile had just decided to introduce data protection as a fundamental right in its own constitution, has decided to set an independent agency, and is also considering the adoption of a law. That's an example amongst many others. But yes, we would very much, I mean, we are very eager to work on Brazil and have that area of free flow of data with Brazil. The other question was, I understand, on the training of Brazilian to comply with the GDPR. Well, again, if another good news that this law would bring is that we would have very similar rules, and therefore complying with Brazilian law would mean that to a very large extent you would use the same rules, the same principles, the same safeguards as under the GDPR. It's good in terms of compliance cost. It's also good in terms of developing, because that's what companies in general want, having compliance program that they can roll out throughout jurisdiction. What we've seen with the adoption of the GDPR, what we can say about few months of experience with the adoption of the GDPR is, of course, the level of knowledge awareness differs very much across industries, across business models. Companies that have a very data-intensive type of model are already very aware about this, because before being a regulatory requirement, this is a question of reputation, this is a question of trust, this is a question of value. For companies that, of course, are a bit less exposed, this indeed requires a certain evolution, a certain awareness or sense of privacy culture, and that's a role, and that's another role that a good privacy data protection agency and authority can play. Is about again diffusing that type of culture. Some of our data protection authorities in Europe have done something very simple, but which have been very useful, having helplines, hotlines for small and medium companies to ask very simple but very important questions. So through that and other training programs, a lot can be done. What we have also seen through this compliance efforts in the EU, which, again, is not finished. It's an evolving and it's a dynamic process, is that, well, many companies have then to go and look back and do some house cleaning and look and do a sort of data mapping, which type of data I collect, for which purpose, and what do I do with that data? Do I just send an email every 6 months to my customers with some news on my new products? Do I sell it? Do I share it with third parties? All this, of course, is possible. It just has to take place within certain safeguards. And that sort of, if you want, checkup or health check or data check inside the company is a very healthy thing to do, which actually is, first of all, a good business practice before being something which is required by laws or regulation, because many companies have first discovered or figured out that they were collecting all sorts of data which is unnecessary for their business model, and therefore they were unnecessarily exposing themselves to liabilities. But others have also found that they were not doing anything with their data, or were not doing sufficiently with the data, or they were not exploiting that data. And as we know, this is a very important resource, sometimes a gold mine on which you may be sitting. I don't know if this answers, but...
Creio que sim, Bruno. Nós temos ainda 5 minutinhos.
Well, I believe you have answered the questions. We still have got 5 minutes. I can see 2 hands for people. Maybe if you are brief, we can try to get your 4 questions and see if we have time. We still have got 5 minutes. So last person there, back of the room. Then there is someone in the middle of the room and 2 people here in the front. So if you can be brief, to 30 seconds, we can have 3 minutes for Bruno to answer the questions. Good morning. I'm Danielle with Packard Lawyers. Bruno mentioned the importance of having an independent authority for UN in its general data protection, and an independent authority to have an observation and inspection so that we could favorably have a decision in Brazil. I understand that EU countries have their local authorities, and probably there are differences, regional differences, cultural differences that also influence on enforcement, on effective inspection. What would be the level, what would be taken into consideration by European Union when analyzing this independent authority in Brazil so that we could be favorably included as part of this free agreement? Good morning. I'm Paulo Purkett. I'm a lawyer specialized in digital law. My question concerns the fact that GDPR, one size doesn't fit all. In other words, there has been a process of adaptation to the different countries. What are the key issues, key points that have been used during the adaptation process? And here we have an Amara. Good morning, I'm an Amara with the Public Prosecution Office in Brazil. The regulation of data protection in EU applies to all those who live in the European Union, even though data protection takes place outside the territory. And it also applies application according to international law of some member countries. So it would be applicable to someone who is a national from an European country who lives abroad. According to international law, that would be my interpretation. I think it's Article 3 of the regulation. So my question is, how have you been facing this issue? If there is any conflict between, let's say, the United States, where they have a different type, different criteria, and a different understanding of articles of incorporation and companies. And the last question. Hi, my name is Bruno as well. I'm with Terra Time. I'm a journalist. Well, if the Brazilian law doesn't have an independent authority, would that prevent us from having free flow of data with Europe or European Union? Okay.
So I will try to answer all this question in 1 minute and 46 seconds. So, there are, I will try to group them. There are two questions about the independent authority.
We're actually working on that, so just
okay.
1 second.
One about the scope, and I must say the other one, I'm not sure I have understood what are the main points during the adaptation process.
So actually, what were the adaptations that you guys had to make in order to accommodate all the interests of the countries involved?
Okay. Within the EU. Okay, so starting maybe with the scope. Let me clarify something here, because your reading of the regulations is partly correct. The GDPR applies only to the processing of data of individuals in the EU, regardless of nationality and citizenship. So that means me, when I'm back in at home in Europe, or you, Brazilian, when you are as tourist or as or visiting Europe for business reasons. When you are in Europe and your data is processed, then it is subject to the GDPR. Of course, for clear rules of international law and others, and for clear rules on jurisdiction. When I am abroad, including in Brazil, when this hotel collects my data when I check in, or when I had to sign a form to allow this organization to use my pictures, voice, and I had to put all sorts of information, including whether I'm married or not, etc., which is a very interesting piece of information for this purpose. Well, this, of course, happened only, EU law doesn't apply to that. Whether I am, regardless of whether I'm a EU citizen or not, I am subject to Brazilian data protection law. What has changed with this article of the regulation is that we say, well, you can have a company which is not established in the EU, but because of its activity, targets specifically individuals in the EU, offers them goods and services, targeting them, allowing them to, you can have a website in Brazil and still allow me to buy that service or that good in euro, for instance, that you would clearly target users, consumers in the EU. So in the digital economy, as we know, you can have an impact on another market, on a population, on the privacy of people, also from a remote distance. So whether the physical criteria of whether you are established or not in the EU as a company processing data is no longer relevant, again, if you target specifically in consumers in the EU. This is simply, again, a common sense, almost a leveling playing field rule. If you want to access to the EU market of 500 million consumers, then you are subject to the rules whether you are established or not in the EU as a company. So that's what the GDPR has added, if you want, to our protection rules in terms of scope, and there's no application of the GDPR to territories or Europeans moving around in other countries of the globe. Then there were questions on the independence. What is independence? I don't know how many lawyers are in this room, but of course, if we start to discuss about a notion like independence, there might be very different views. And indeed, there are different ways to organize that independence. But I would say that independence concerns three different aspects. I would say a structural, organizational aspect, functional aspect, and then the powers, the function that that authority has. An organizational aspect is that indeed in the EU we have different models. We have some data protection authorities that are appointed by parliament, other by government, other by a combination. We have some data protection authorities that have that are both the data protection authorities and the authority responsible for access to public information. But what is important is that the members of these authorities, regardless of who appoints them, and often you have a combination of a government appointment confirmed by Parliament, they enjoy an independence, a structural independence, which means that they cannot be removed or dismissed just because they didn't take a decision that pleases the Parliament or the government and this kind of things, so that they are protected like general members of the judiciary are protected from. Functional independence in the sense that when they are taking their decision, when they are investigating cases, when they are deciding whether a violation deserves or not a sanction, when they are issuing guidelines, they have to be independent in the sense that they cannot be subject to direct or indirect instructions by anybody. Of course, they act under the control of the judiciary as any public body, but in the exercise of their function, that exercise might be free from influence, from instructions from anybody else. And then, what is very important, if we want to have an effective and truly independence, as we know, independence is also a question of means. They have to have the expertise, the resources, the powers that ensure them to effectively exercise their functions. Let me say something maybe on sanction on that. I hear often, because that was very easy for the headlines of newspaper, GDPR means 4% fine for violation of data protection law. Again, it's one of those simplification myths, or if not urban legend, of the GDPR. The GDPR considers that data protection, like any other area of law, and in this area of law in particular, is something serious for which and certain violation can be extremely harmful, and therefore you need to have credible, proportionate but credible sanction. Also, and this is also good for business, because in a system where you don't have any sanction, compliance has no value, and it's a system which is open to free riders. What we have introduced in terms of sanction is a toolbox where you have financial sanction, and 4% is the maximum amount that, of course, has to be calculated in function of 11 different elements that are listed in the GDPR: the duration, the gravity, the negligent or deliberate nature of the violation. But there are also alternative measures that can be taken in case, for instance, the violation is only of a minor nature. Injunctive relief, warnings, recommendation before going to sanction. So we have a broad tool. Yes. Then the question was, including from Bruno, was, well, what are you looking for to have this adequacy decision? What do you really need? Well, adequacy is not about identity. It's not about me going around and trying to find photocopies of the GDPR. But indeed, there should be effective oversight and effective enforcement, and an independent data protection authority is a central requirement in an adequacy finding. How this authority is organized, these are also matters of local constitutional law, public law. All this, of course, can be dealt with in different ways in different systems. But let me, and that will be my final word, does it mean that if there's no adequacy decision, there's no flow of data between the EU and Brazil? Of course not. We have, as I tried to explain, we have, as you have in the Brazilian law, a broad ranges of different tools for transfers: contract, consent, what we call binding corporate rules. But the advantage, and it's an extremely important advantage of an adequacy decision, is that with an adequacy decision, Brazil is assimilated to a member country of the EU. You don't need to have to show any, you don't need to put in place any other safeguards. You don't need to put in place, you're not subject to any other requirements in terms of having, for instance, specific contractual clauses that provide for specific safeguards. So it's an enormous advantage, especially for small and medium enterprises in terms of reduced costs. And it's an enormous, and it's a very significant facilitator of exchange. We believe that, and again, this is a sovereign choice that Brazil has to take, that on the basis of the legislation as we can see it today, this would be excellent basis for building an arrangement, an adequacy arrangement. And then I have no time to answer to the last question, which was what are the main points that we had during our own internal process. Many of the points I mentioned, whether to include the public sector or not. And we solve it by having an overarching legislation. How to ensure that balance by having many tools, many grounds for processing and also for further processing. What are the conditions and the limitations for the exercise of certain rights? What about the introduction of new rights? We introduced new rights. Data breach notification, is 72 hours too short or not? For instance, that was a big, but nobody really looked and saw that it's in principle 72 hours. Our data protection authorities have explained that if you need more time, you just need to inform the authority. That also shows how a data protection authority can interpret the rules. Portability was a big discussion. So we had, it's 99 articles. I think we had 99 discussions, and they took a long time. That's why also it is, I'm full of admiration for the work of the Brazilian Congress, which reached unanimity on such a good text in a relatively short time. Probably we need to come here and learn something from you. So, thank you very much.
Obrigado, Bruno.
Bruno will stay with us throughout the day. You may stop in during coffee and ask questions. We're going to have a break now, and we'll be back at 10:30 for the next panel. Thank you.
Martinhão. Good morning, everyone. I'm Maxiliano Salvador Martinhão. I am the Secretary of Development and Innovation with the Ministry of Information Technology. I'm also the coordinator of CGI.br. I would like to greet everyone, ladies and gentlemen, participating in the IX Seminar of CGI. We are all delighted to be here once again, which is a debate and a landmark in what we are doing. This is the 11th edition of the seminar, and it's taking a very important moment when the Congress has just approved the first general legislation on data protection in Brazil, which is right now to be approved by the president. I've noticed that in recent months, global discussions on data privacy has gained more and more momentum. In March, we've heard about Cambridge Analytics. In May, GDPR got into place, which is the European Data Protection Regulation. All over, including in Brazil, these discussions have gained more relevance about the impact of dealing with personal data in the landscape of elections. So the topics you are going to discuss in the seminar, which used to be the interest of few specialists, now it's something discussed continuously by all of us, discussed in schools, at home, and in the media. As a representative of the federal government in Brazil, I would like to say that we have really evolved in this discussion, and this is probably the result of better understanding of digitalization and internet as something that is cross-section and not sectorial based, which is absolutely key for the development of our country. We understand that the country is going through a moment of digital transformation, which deeply impacts all the industries in our economy and all government areas. Digitalization of productive processes, of education, government, and the interaction among people bring a number of challenges. Some might not be new, but they are all impacted by internet, and data protection is among them. Internet technology has deeply changed the scope, the reach, and the possibilities of data processing and storage. And this is why we think that it's important to have a legislation on data protection with tools that can protect citizens and at the same time allowing growth of digital economy according to what OECD states and the recommendations of other countries. I would like to remind you that the Brazilian strategy of digital transformation, which has been developed throughout 2017 and approved in March this year, thanks to the work developed by Digital Policy Secretary Tiago, this strategy expects to include a general legislation of data protection and the creation or the appointment of a national authority that would be responsible for protecting personal data and dealing with international data flow so that we can standardize best practices and grant legal safety on data protection.
As the coordinator here, these were the terms of a public notice released yesterday by the Governance Committee of Brazil and by Secretary Tiago, along with Council Member Flavia Lefevre and Henrique, also addressing the same points. That same note is worth mentioning that we were cautious to observe that we're going through a process of approving this document, which will eventually reach the president. So we were careful at the CGI to make sure that this note does not interfere and does not bind any members of government as it refers to internal discussion problems. So at this moment, we are now going through a phase of intense discussions among different stakeholders about the sanctioning of the bill. We are reaching the apex of all discussions which began back in 2010. As soon as the bill is passed, and depending on the way it is passed, we see a great amount of work going forward. The country will need to go through a very steep learning curve so that the law is adequately implemented with legal safety. And this seminar, sponsored by the Governance Committee of Internet in Brazil, has a fundamental importance in that respect. So once again, congratulations to all organizers of the seminar. They managed to gather throughout 2 days, and at such an important moment, the most important names in the industry to deal with a very important and relevant topic, which is privacy and data protection. Thank you, enjoy the seminar, and see you next time. So moving on with our schedule, I'd like to invite Tiago Jardim from AMRE, who will be facilitating the next panel. The panel called General Data Protection Regulation, First Impressions and Expectations about the Modernization Process of Protection of Data, of Personal Data.
Bom dia a todos.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to invite the other panel members to join us here on stage. We already have Facebook representative, Laura Juanes. I'd like to invite also to join us Bohana Bellamy from the Center for Information Policy Leadership. Boyana Bellamy.
Convido a mesa.
I'd like also to invite Professor Danilo Doneda from the State University of Rio de Janeiro. And also the representative from the European Council, Sophie Kwasny. So to start this first panel about the general rules about data protection and the Convention 108, we'll go straight to the point. We're slightly behind schedule, so I give the floor over to Mrs. Bellamy, who will have a PowerPoint presentation which will be shown as we move on.
Good morning, everybody. It's absolute pleasure to be here. I first of all want to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It doesn't take a long time for me to be here. It doesn't take long to get me invited because I do love this country very much, and I've had a great pleasure to work with a number of you and the CGI and multi-stakeholders already on this data protection bill in Brazil. And I haven't been to Sao Paulo, we've been to Brasilia and Rio, but I think this is great to be here. So secondly, congratulations. I think this is also should be a day of celebration. and recognition that all this hard work has yielded some really good result, and you have got a data protection bill that is going to be hopefully signed into law immediately or imminently, I hear as well. And of course, as such, you have got a great opportunity to have included some of the best practices, best concepts from everywhere else in the world. And you know, I was delighted to be a part of that. I must congratulate you particularly on the process by which this law has been put together. It is very unusual to see this really truly multi-stakeholder approach, from ministries to experts to civil societies to business leaders, technology experts as well. Everybody had something to say, and the government did listen to everybody, and I thought that was really impressive. Now, what I would like to do today, and I hope the slides are going to be up. Well, I can't see them, but I do have some slides. I thought I'll leave you with that. No, there are no slides. Okay. Okay, so...
I just need to download first.
Okay. Oh, there they are. There they are. Okay. They had a problem. Yes, it takes, you know, data flows around the world, but it takes a long time to come from London to here for these slides. And what I'd like to do is, I run CIPL. We are a global privacy think tank. We work with 60 global biggest organizations in the world and the regulators, policymakers. And as I have said, we've had a lot of work done here in Brazil, but also in Europe with GDPR. I was last week in Singapore as well, where these discussions are also taking place. They're amending data protection law to kind of take it to the next level. What I've been asked to do, and you see the slides haven't quite translated because there is a whole section there of kind of good things in GDPR, but anyway, you can't see them. So, Bruno, you have to trust me that there is a whole slide of very good things in GDPR, but I'm going to tell you what they are. So, Bruno Bioni has asked me to share with you some of my own take on where we are with the GDPR. What are some of the lessons learned, the positive ones, and also potentially concerns, and how may that reflect for you here in Brazil? First of all, what I would like to say is that I see Brazilian data protection law very much on the sort of convergence path with the GDPR, and certainly some of these good elements of GDPR have been taken on board. First one, accountability. The need for organizations to implement comprehensive privacy program. This is encouraged in GDPR. It's encouraged in your law as well. And of course, there are many ways in which that can be demonstrated through codes of conduct, binding corporate rules, certifications, privacy program. The second point of GDPR is risk-based approach. Now, there was a question before in the morning, sort of how do we ensure that all these organizations and companies in Brazil, in all sectors and in all sizes, are able to comply with this new law? And I tell you, it is through risk-based approach. What does this mean? It means that organizations should be putting more effort and compliance in the areas that are higher risks to freedoms and rights of individuals, and less effort in areas which are lower risk. And this is perfect for SMEs as well, because if small and medium-sized organization or startup doesn't have very much data, they're not very digital, then there isn't very much to do. But if you do have a lot of data, even if you're a small organization, but you have a lot of data, you're doing lots of intrusive, sensitive data processing, that is a higher risk. Then you should be doing more. That's what GDPR has in its core. And I think this is a concept that we would really like to see here in Brazil implemented not only through the law, but the forthcoming regulation and interpretation by the Data Protection Authority and the Council. The third good thing about GDPR is this multiple legal basis for processing, and that again is reflected in your law as well. That means consent is not the only way we can process data. In fact, it's not appropriate for this new fourth industrial revolution where I keep going with my smart device or or Fitbit that I haven't got today, but I normally do, and emitting things, I can't be expected to keep consenting. I want onus on you, organizations, to use my data responsibly. That is the new way forward, and that's why legitimate interest processing, necessity for contract, all of these grounds, as Bruno has mentioned, are very important. You have them in Brazilian law as well. There is also more flexibility for new uses of data for purposes which are not incompatible in GDPR, and that is really important to enable this fourth industrial revolution that we are talking about. Individuals, of course, are empowered, another progress by GDPR, not only through the rights, and they're very important, but through accountability and through transparency. Transparency has been enhanced. We have to tell people how we are using their data, not because the law says so, but because it's a part of customer relationship. There are some good elements in GDPR around one-stop shop. This is a typical European concept, but really cooperation, consistency among various data protection authorities in various countries, because we really need one law to enable this free flow of data. And digital Europe, we need one law in Europe. We can't have differences. And that, of course, is important as well here and globally. And then final point, GDPR does promote good data governance. It promotes good data hygiene. It can be a business enabler because those companies who understand that the importance of digital is driving their growth and prosperity, they are going to be better equipped for dealing with this new digital world. Now, there are some concerns, of course, and that is around how future-proof this law is around automated decision-making. I think Brazilian take on that, I actually think it's a better draft, what you have got than what we have today. And of course, there are some other things which are around not having accountability be a tick-the-box exercise. This is not about ticking compliance, it's about embedding privacy in the culture of DNA of organization, and that is very important. And then finally, it all depends on how this is interpreted and implemented. So the role of data protection authority is going to be incredibly important in Europe to make sure that this law is interpreted in a progressive way versus perhaps more regressive. I wanted to share with you some insights from a survey. This is available on our website. You can read it. We actually surveyed in October 2017 global companies on their readiness with GDPR. We asked them where is their highest level of impact and where is their lowest level of impact. And these are some interesting insights. Developing a privacy management program was seen to have a very high level of impact. Use and contracting with third parties was seen to have, again, very high level of impact. Data breach notification, organizations have to be ready for notifying breaches. Again, companies felt this was also significant impact. And finally, compliance with individual rights. I don't have time, of course, to go through the details, but please, I do encourage you to have a look at that survey. It has got some interesting data. And as you are embarking on hopefully implementation of the new Brazilian law in 2019 and onwards, you may draw some interesting conclusions from some of the findings that our survey shows. One of the elements that GDPR puts really centrally is the concept of accountability. And I appreciate the accountability is not something that actually translates very well. Actually, I'm not sure what the Portuguese word is. But what it means really is that organizations have to be able to implement a comprehensive privacy management program that has got these universal elements to ensure that A, they comply with the law, and B, that they protect really data ultimately, and finally that they also use data for the beneficial purposes. They also have to be able to verify whether the program we have put in place is the one that is being complied with, and they have to be able to demonstrate that both internally to the management board and externally to data protection regulators, to public, to privacy advocates, to everybody, right? So in some ways, this is a central concept that I'm glad that has found way in Brazilian law. And it is a concept that travels very well, as Laura often says, travels very well across the world. We see this in Canada, we see it in Hong Kong, we see it in Singapore, in Australia, of course GDPR, here in Brazil as well, and that is the positive. And why? Because despite what you think, and we are many lawyers here, laws alone cannot protect people. Laws alone are just things on paper, words on paper, that unless they are implemented through accountability, they're not going to create any effect. And in fact, this accountability model protects people much more than any rights, any laws that they may have on paper and are never properly enforced. Now, in terms of what these elements are, please, I don't have very much time to discuss this here, but we have just at CIPL written 2 papers that are available on our website. Please go and pick them up. I have some references for you on the next slide. And these papers really talk about the history of accountability, what are the elements of accountability, how they map into every data protection law globally, and then why should regulators and policymakers incentivize organizations who manage to do this well. And this is very important, and I see this in Brazilian law as well. There is this incentive for organizations who have got good practice and good faith compliance, and that incentive is mitigation and enforcement, but there could be some other ones. I will just tell you, in Singapore, we've discussed this with Singapore government and Data Protection Authority. They're even considering tax breaks, tax benefits for SMEs and startups who implement privacy management program. I mean, that's innovation, right? So that's how we have to think about these things. So please look at our program, look at our paper in a little bit more detail. Here, you will have these slides for distribution. They're free. This really maps various elements of requirements of also Brazilian law and GDPR to how accountability elements have to be demonstrated in practice. And it's really important, no matter what law, no matter what certification, no matter what standard, you're always going to organize your compliance in this way. And that's what makes it effective. We know it does. Now, the second thing I wanted to address very briefly, and I know we will talk about this later in the afternoon, is the role of Data Protection Authority. Now, I know that this is a point that has been debated a lot here in Brazil. And so we at the Center have also written a paper about the role of DPA. We have shared some of these insights also with stakeholders here in Brazil. And I think that the Brazilian model that has been proposed of a data protection authority plus the National Council actually works very well and could work very well. So I encourage you to continue in that spirit. Why do I think we need a central data protection authority? Bruno has talked about some of these aspects already, but sometimes it's not bad to just repeat them. The more you repeat, the more they stick. It really is. This is an area of law which is incredibly specialized. Those lawyers in the room, those data protection officers in the room, you know that you have to know technology, you have to understand data, you have to understand the law, you have to understand human rights, you have to understand how to talk to people, how to communicate, and it's incredibly important to have expertise centrally on this point, and that's what Data Protection Authority can provide, not only to organizations and individuals, but to ensure there is a trust and confidence in digital Brazil and digital economy, and that is incredibly important. This is not just about protection of human rights and data privacy of individuals, it's also about enabling appropriate digital economy where data is used responsibly. And I think Maximilian has said so, your law says so in its Article 2, I think, and I think that is really what the role of a DPA should be as well. The second point, it's important to have consistency and legal certainty for all of you, businesses, SMEs, startups, but also for individuals, one single point of contact where I can go, complain, ask questions, understand, and so on. It also promotes uniform and best practices, uniform standards in terms of how the law is implemented across the country. I have seen that your law is very principle-based, and that is absolutely right, and there's going to be more meat on the bones provided through accountability and through the DPA as well. And that's why it's absolutely essential to have it. It also prevents sort of companies engaging in what we call forum shopping, going to regulators or to places where it is actually, there is a bit of less protection potentially, and enables really much more consistency across the board. And of course, importantly, it also represents Brazil internationally. There was a lot of discussion about the fact that the world really is globally connected. The data of Brazilians are not only going to be in Brazil, they're going to be moving around the clock. And the same with our data. As you know, I used to be head of privacy for Accenture for many years. I know Accenture has got huge operations here in Brazil. Lots of European data comes here and it's actually processed here. So we need to make sure that there is this consistency in how data protection authorities see things globally, and the convergence as well. And my final point on this would be around cost. I hear a lot of discussions of whether this is costly and how would this work. There are some innovative approaches being taken, and some of this is something that we also have been advocating for. Richard Thomas was a former Information Commissioner, UK. He has written a very short note around how can actually DPA be co-funded by a very simple levy that is paid by every single organization who processes data, and then funding through government as well. And that kind of works. That's how UK is being funded today, and they have about 600 people in the UK DPA. My final point is really kind of sharing with you some of the thinking that we at CIPL have put together around what constitutes the most effective regulation and oversight by Data Protection Authority. Now, this is all detailed in much more details in our paper called Regulating for Results. I have some references, URLs. It's on our website. Please download it. We also have it in Portuguese. Because we really want to share, as well as in Spanish, we want to share this really much more globally. And the whole paper is really based on the nudge theory that is so popular in the behavioral economics. I mean, you know, Nobel laureate got a Nobel Prize for that. Richard Thaler, right, got a Nobel Prize for this nudge theory. And what we have done is really applied that nudge theory to the world of data protection. We worked with a professor at Oxford, Christopher Hodges, who is an expert on effective regulation. And our paper really talks about that data protection authorities who are most effective have to be first selective to be effective. They have to prioritize. They have to adopt risk-based approach. They have to set strategies and set them openly and transparently vis-a-vis organizations and businesses. That is really important to set that up. And we are seeing a number of DPAs in Europe and outside Europe transparently sharing what their strategy for enforcement is, where they're going to be paying attention more, where they're going to be doing less, and so on. Second is that DPAs really should be favoring constructive engagement with accountable organizations. And that means encouraging, rewarding those who do well, promoting good compliance. And again, we are seeing a number of DPAs publicly say that that's how they're going to behave. That, again, is a nudge theory. It's sort of the herd mentality. If your competitor has got a good privacy program, you will probably want to copy that and do that, not because there's law, but because your competitor is doing it. So using that instinct of actually market forces of doing the right thing is really important. Understanding the motives for compliance and incentivizing good compliance is also something we talk a lot about. And then finally, I know there's a lot of discussion here on enforcement. Enforcement is important. Every law has to be enforced. But this is a law which also has to be, where enforcement has to play limited role. So incentivization, engagement should be favored as a first port of call, and then enforcement left for those who deliberately, negligently, willfully keep making mistakes and keep doing it repeatedly as well. And that is kind of a good way that I think probably majority of the DPAs globally will be going with. Now, I'm going to stop here because I know we're going to be talking about this particular topic in the afternoon, and then I'll share more information in that session. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Bojana. And before I give the floor to the next speaker, just one brief comment. In the very beginning of your presentation, you went on about how our life has become so dependent on digital devices. And then you started giving examples, and then you picked this phone, right? And then you said, my digital device, but this is actually my digital device.
It probably tracks me as well, right? Is that good?
Because I'm from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, possibly, yes. Turning to Portuguese, o nosso próximo palestrante...
Speaker will be Professor Doneda, needs no introduction, and I pass the floor over to Professor. Thank you.
Vou voltar ao português, meu papel de minoria na mesa.
Well, I speak Portuguese, being a minority in this panel. I am going not to talk about some transaction documents, and maybe there are even other documents that should be mentioned in addition to the document 109, but I'm going to talk about data protection law, which is directly related with something that has generated other documents. But before that, it's always necessary to remind you that here, in the 9th Seminar of Data Protection, sponsored by CGI, we are on the verge of a new step. Probably next year, and I hope we are here again next year, we'll be talking about implementation of a concrete legislation dealing with other urgent issues. But we should probably recall that what we have discussed in the past 9 years has been absolutely essential for the moment we are currently today. Some of the seminars, maybe we had smaller audiences, not so specialized products, such as going through Egypt, crossing the deserts and the difficult path. Finally, we have come to our destination with the approval of the legislation and are close to having it enacted. Today we heard from Congressman Orlando Silva that the law has taken a lot to be designed and prepared. And you see, all bills have its own political, social time of preparation. It cannot simply rely on technical issues because it really takes time for people to think and reflect. And today, this bill has received the buy-in of the academia, the social society, the social sector, and the private sector, and the government. So everyone has recognized that our current text is the best consensus. And it has to be approved in its entirety. Anything different from that would be considered like a step back, as a setback to our discussions and what we have achieved. Data protection is one key element for the country to go into information economy with a mature status, being able to participate in this new environment, ensuring the rights of its citizens and protecting businesses with the necessary legal security so that we can really work reliably towards the best results, protecting individual rights and the interest of everyone who is represented in it. I think we have been through very interesting moments. Convention 108, you see, Sophie, there is a mistake in my slide. Convention 108 had one's first writing in 1980. It was the supporting document. Many politicians, academia representatives that generated the first draft were part of the discussion, and then in 2008 and not 2013, that's my mistake, it was finally enacted and updated. The same year in which European Union and European councils are completely different bodies. So Convention 108 is focused on human rights, and European Union is where many issues are harmonized and agreed upon. And one of them is to have the protection of human rights, including privacy of data. In 1995, European Union approved one directive which became a law in all member countries about data protection, and finally, May 25th, a revisitation of that with the GDPR. It's always good to bear in mind that general regulation is not innovating or coming up with a revolution of a new way of seeing things. It's an update. There are new elements that have been incorporated about the matter. And for some others who are highly familiarized with that, maybe they can go further into details. I think that the key issue in the new GDPR is the fact that it has now strong, effective, robust law, which can be enforced all over throughout European Union. As a consequence, now companies and member countries have to be in compliance with the new regulation, and it has become really imperative all over. And the general law of data protection, and we expect it to be enforced by next Tuesday in Brazil, is a result of discussions that we have had for a long time. This is the unanimous approval. We owe it to Senator Ricardo Ferraz, Congressman Orlando Silva, and below we have the reporter of GDPR, Jean-Philippe Albert, which was absolutely instrumental. We don't have a reporter of Convention 108, but Sophie can certainly represent them. Since I've met her, she has had a key role in the dialogue and in the dissemination of Convention 108. 127 countries have some data on data protection. UN countries, 97. Of 127 countries, there is a concentration among countries that are more industrialized or less industrialized. And in this updated map, Brazil is a new color, orange, which is a color just given for countries which are about to approve the law. I have asked this ad hoc map to be prepared to us because we don't know if Brazil is going to have a general law of data protection or not. What is a general law of data protection? It defines rights to citizens concerning data protection. It sets limits and rules for the government and private entities to address data in a very horizontal, universal way in all levels of economy, which also applies to the public sector. Of course, it takes some adaptations depending on different circumstances, but the citizens will be safeguarded in terms of rights, no matter where they are, regardless of the area of economy, banks, pharmacies, hospitals, schools, or even towards the government. Let's say public pension or retirement pension. So we would be absolutely sure that abusive use of our data would be protected or subject to sanctions. I say that we don't know whether it would be approved or not. A veto is still a possibility. A veto to one of the key pillars of the law will really put us back into the beige color, go back to square zero. I know I am sounding pessimistic. I don't think it's going to happen, but we should bear in mind that this is still a possibility. Now I would like to tell you about our journey till the day today and some elements that may be subject to a veto. They would really impair as a whole our bill, which is now becoming a law. It has been addressed for many years, since 2005. That's when the first initiatives within the Brazilian government started to be articulated to harmonize data protection because of an internal discussion in Mercosur. In a document in 2010, was signed by Brazil the same year in which the Ministry of Justice prepared the first basic document, which was open for public debate, which is the embryo of the recently approved bill. In 2015, it was open for public hearing again. 2016, it was consolidated by the ministry and submitted to the Congress. And recently, in 2018, the bill was unanimously approved by the Congress and the Senate. Throughout the entire process, there was a constant and very profuse dialogue comprising the Brazilian model and foreign models, especially the ones that we have here represented. This was not as an attempt just to copy foreign models, but rather we have to be constantly attentive to the fact that data flow from one side to the other. And in the past, some would say that no regulation would be possible for data flow because they are constantly exchanged. But data are used to be exchanged, aren't they? This is even the natural aspect of data. We expect data to be disseminated and cross from one side to the other through networks. Therefore, there is a trend to have convergence of regulatory solutions. The solution of one country necessarily has to talk to the solutions of other countries. Otherwise, we would create a Babel's Tower with different rules, and in practice, it would prevent international flow of data. Reason why European Union decided to unify these affairs, to favor data protection and protect the rights throughout all countries. So this trend to convergency, since the very beginning of our project, we have been observing international standards and regulations so that we could have a harmonious insertion of these very same regulations into the Brazilian regulations and laws. Our model was based on the initial drafting of Convention 108. It was, let's say, the backbone of our legislation, and we can see the influence throughout many chapters. There has been an influence of Latin American models, habeas data, Directive of 95 as well. Culturally, we are a country whose law is very similar to the continental Europe law. So this is why we have so much similarity. GDPR is extremely important, and everyone who works with that. When GDPR leaked, fortunately, it influenced the countries that were already working on it. We had internet public consultations, over 15 public hearings, leading to unanimous approval. And now in the few minutes I already have, I'm going to talk about some key elements that are part of our law and also the others. There is a clear harmonization about the key object, which is personal data. Personal data related to natural person which is identified or non-identified. This is an international standard. It is a definition that is part of our legislation from 2011. And in Brazil, there are two types of misunderstanding. Personal data being understood as being specific, let's say registration, administrative data, as being differently from personal data. No, everything that relates to a person is considered personal data. It does not mean that it's something for public access or secret. Personal data is personal data. Now, the kind of scheme to which it's going to be protected depend on other qualifying factors. But personal data refers to a natural person, and it should be subject to the proposal and the protection of law. Anonymized data is a constant dilemma, and no legislation to present has clearly defined that, because there is anonymous data can be transformed into personal data, and it has to be treated by the law. Concerning the factors that really govern us to managing personal data, we list 10. GDPR sets 7. Even though there is no discrepancy among them both, the 4 additional reasons in the Brazilian law compared to GDPR are some unfolding of other interests described in the European legislation. So these are reasons for explaining why we need the law. Rights. We have a very extensive law, more than what GDPR or Convention 108 have, even though some of them are unfolding and some of them are not even part of strict census rights, such as revoking a consent, which is, for example, the fact that you consent and you are free to have your rights being addressed or not by one specific kind of handling. Public sector. Some exceptions have been considered, and it's always important to emphasize before veto that any impact that would materially exclude the public sector from the enforcement of the law would simply impair completely data protection legislation, transforming it into something very hermetic to citizens who wouldn't really know how data would be handled, and that would be also non-compatible with the international legislation. I'm already running late, so I'll just speed up a little bit. There are a number of possibilities for data, international data transfer, acknowledging different situations as being a possible situation to transfer data internationally. So those who want to address data, including international transfer, would work transparently, considering one of these transfer possibilities. Well, sanctions, when we talk about a law, especially if we wanted to be cross-section, impacting all the different sectors and industries, would necessarily have to be subject to that. We need sanctions, of course, sanctions that can be adaptable, and consistent sanctions. A lot is said about compliance, best practices. However, in the history of humanity, there had always been some chapter for sanctions. And if without them, there is no enforceability. It is really required to have some mechanism of sanction so that everyone is aware of the fact that there are penalties if someone decides not to comply with the law. For those who decide to refrain from following all the elements of the law. If you pay close attention, it depends on the methodology that will be defined by the national authorities, open for public consultation, and only then start applying penalties and sanctions. So it includes warning, which is just a previous step before a penalty. So daily penalties based on indexation, inflation, and a number of others, which would be really essential to encourage compliance. And finally, enforcement of who would be the authority responsible for doing that. So the law expects a national agency of data protection to be created. I don't think that there is any bias here. I think it's really acceptable to have the creation of this agency. But once again, I say that should any parts be vetoed, I don't think that our law would be readily to be enforced. So I think we need this law to be accepted in its entirety. Thank you very much, Tiago.
Vou passar imediatamente a palavra.
I'll give the floor over directly to Ms. Laura Juanes from Facebook. Hello, good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'll be speaking a few words in Portuguese, or Português, if you will, and then I'll switch to English. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for the invitation. It is a great pleasure for me to be here at such an important moment in this country. This is my first visit in Brazil my first visit to talk about this subject goes back to 2012 when GDPR was started to be discussed in Europe. So both in Brazil and here, I do believe that we have come a long way to arrive at the completion of this first stage of this journey, right? A journey which still has a lot of ground to cover in several senses. So I'll now switch into English, if I may. I apologize for my broken Portuguese, but I needed to say something in Portuguese. Thank you for bearing with me.
But I think it's important. So we've been talking, this session is about GDPR and Convention 108, and we've been talking also about the very important moment that we're living here in Brazil, right? But I do think it's important to look beyond and to look at what is going on in the world. Many countries like Brazil are finding their way, right? Through first or through second generation privacy laws, they are finding how to the right way of protecting privacy and enhancing innovation. And they're also, through this journey, they're learning from best practices and also, why not, from some mistakes. And they're looking at what is going on in different parts of the world. So here's the outlook of countries that are currently looking at somehow legislating privacy around the world. And I'm sure if we compare Danilo's map with my map, there are some inconsistencies there. So if you see something that is missing here, all sources are absolutely welcome. And I think it is also important to understand the themes and the trends behind these movements, right? I think we say often that, and it's really true, privacy doesn't happen in a vacuum.
It's not an isolated concept. It exists, and our notions, our beliefs of privacy are formed by our legal, our cultural, our societal traditions, and also by our own, very own personal experiences. And I think this manifests in different ways in different parts of the world, and that's something that we need to be conscious about as we start thinking about how to go and how to address these first or second generation laws. So, for example, in the US, I think we're seeing a shift in the debates. Before, privacy used to be associated with some other concept, with trade or competition or unfairness on surveillance, and we're going to a different stage where privacy is existing on its own, so to speak, and we're seeing a number of initiatives towards comprehensive laws or towards comprehensive set of principles. So it's a space certainly worth watching. I would say in Latin America, adequacy aspirations have been a strong driver throughout the number of legislative efforts that we've seen, which has led to similarities and to convergence throughout the region. Sometimes, and I'll speak a little bit about what Bruno alluded to before about myths and misunderstandings of European law. It's also, I think, again, going back to where we're coming from, the ABS data and the consumer protection have had a very strong influence in privacy legislations in Latin America. In Asia, the drivers are very diverse, right? Countries like Japan and countries like New Zealand are very driven and very motivated by adequacy. Others are looking at mechanisms like CBPRs. We have very hybrid approaches. I would say that this region is the one where it's less possible to say there is any sort of standard or any sort of common framework. The drivers are also very different. Security is a constant concern, but also other elements like content regulation or elements like protecting and enhancing innovation are driving forces of the different approaches that we see around the world. One thing that is common in this, one thing that is common in all of these conversations that we're having around the world is the prevalence of the GDPR word in all of these conversations, right? A few months ago, Boyan and I, we were at an event in New York. She was at a panel talking about GDPR, and I was at the following panel talking about trends in the rest of the world. And I was saying, and this was probably like May 26 or May 27, and I was telling Boyan, oh, I'm so happy I don't have to talk about GDPR. I'm going to talk about something else. And then everyone in the panel, as we were covering the different regions and talking about the different parts of the world, GDPR was the word coming up every 2 or 3 sentences, right? So certainly the presence of GDPR is felt around the world. What is remarkable also is that despite having discussed GDPR ad nauseum in Europe and outside of Europe, and despite we've been talking about GDPR since 2012, there is extensive literature out there. There is a proliferation of experts, and I would caution the word experts when it comes to GDPR as well. Everything needs to be taken into context. But the reality is that it is a very complex text, and it has led to plenty of legends and myths, and the broken telephone works. The broken telephone happens a lot when it comes to GDPR. It travels in headlines, and headlines, as we know, don't tell us the full story, and sometimes they don't even tell us the correct story. So I wanted to take a little bit of time, and I think we've talked a little bit about this, and we've heard Bruno and others allude to this, but I think it's important to set a level playing field so that we can all have conversations at the same level when it comes to GDPR. So I'll go through these quite quickly because some of them have been alluded to in other conversations, right? The myth, one of the first universal myths that I hear is that privacy is the right that always prevails in Europe, and that it prevails over any other fundamental right. That is absolutely false, and you only have to go to the first article of GDPR that says the regulation protects fundamental rights and freedoms of natural persons, right? It's not only about privacy, and that's also that's one of the that's one of the first myths that I hear. Myth number 2 is that everything is personal, right? Every type of data under GDPR is personal. That is absolutely false. Anonymous information is out of scope. Pseudonymization is encouraged throughout the text, and over-identification is also discouraged. And I point usually to this Article 11 because it's often ignored when it comes to conversations around GDPR. And basically what it says is that organizations should not be required to over-identify and to acquire more data simply for the purposes of complying with the law, right? So definitely something worth considering when we're looking about myths and urban legends around GDPR. We've talked a little bit about this as well, right? It's all about consent. That is absolutely false. GDPR has 6 legal bases, which have the Brazilian regime, as Danilo just told us. Now we have 10 legal bases in Brazil, and even when it comes to sensitive data, there are 10 exceptions to the general prohibition of not collecting sensitive data. So definitely worth taking that into account as well. Something that we hear all the time, right? Joint and several liability is the default. Everyone across the chain is liable. Guilty is a presumption. That is also absolutely false, and that is also something that has also been incorporated into the Brazilian framework as well, right? There is a clear definition, a clear distinction between the different roles that each of the organizations plays along the data cycle. So we have definitions of controllers, of processors, recipients, joint controllers, which is not in that slide, defining the roles and the responsibilities of every actor in the process. The concept of general, joint, and several liability is something that comes from consumer protection law, but somehow I think this is one of the headlines that for some reason travels out of Europe and there is a disconnect between what GDPR really is and then what people think GDPR is. Myth number 5, data can only be exported to adequate countries. Bruno has talked about this as well, and certainly, again, this is something that Brazilians have been able to debunk as well, right? And to incorporate a wide number and a wide range of mechanisms to be able to transfer data and to move data around securely. One thing that has not traveled well at all, and Boyan and I were discussing this earlier, and perhaps it's worth spending some time as we move into this new phase of interpretation and implementation, now in Brazil, hopefully in a few days, and also in Europe, is the risk-based approach. And I don't know, perhaps because generally we think of laws as a set of what you can do and what you can't do, what you're allowed and what you're forbidden to do, and then incorporating a risk-based approach is more complicated to translate. So this is one headline that I don't think has made it really outside of Europe, and is one of the key elements of European legislation, and something that we organizations and that regulators and enforcers are going to have to collectively work in implementing and doing work in interpreting and implementing together. So I want to leave that here as well as one of the concepts that perhaps hasn't made the headlines, but it's in the core essence. It's in the very essence of European legislation. And before I finished, I also wanted to spend a little bit of time showing some of the releases, some of our recent privacy updates, inspired under GDPR, but rolled out globally to every single user out there. Our efforts for inspired through GDPR compliance are probably, I want to say, like one of the largest multi-stakeholder efforts within the company, which have included as well multi-stakeholder inside and outside the company. We've incorporated all sorts of professions and perspectives, not only within the Facebook planet, but also outside of Facebook and with regulators, experts, advocates, real experts, not so-called experts. And as part of this process, these are some of the things that we have implemented. One of the things that we've heard often, one of the criticisms that we've listened to is that our settings were difficult and that while we had privacy controls, they were difficult to find. So we launched a new settings where all of our controls, including our privacy controls, are much easier to find. So we converge, to use the word convergence, to make everything much more accessible and much more easy to locate. We also launched a new redesigned shortcuts menu. People also told us that, we also heard that education about privacy and security should be much easier to find than it really was. Our experience now is much more visual and much more easy to find. Things like such important things like increasing the security of your account, reviewing your account and what you may have shared, controlling your ad experience, and managing your profile settings are all available now under the privacy shortcuts menu. We also launched a new Access Your Information tool and a new Download Your Information tool. Your Access tool allows you to exclude information that you may have shared in the past, and the Download Your Information, which is a tool that we already had, but right now it's much more improved, it's much more easier to use, much more comprehensive. It includes things like your photos or your contacts, which we didn't have in the past. And I know I have a few minutes left. I wanted to finish just saying this is just the beginning. We know we have a lot to do. We know we have a lot of work to do, and I want to assure you that we are doing it in order to give people the understanding and the control that they deserve, so that they feel they can trust our services. I invite you to check our newsroom post, which is where we continue to release all of our updates and all of the steps that we're taking to protect and enhance people's privacy, and to keep up to date with these efforts in this area and many others. And I will leave it there, and I'll thank you all for your presence and for your attention, and I look forward to having a conversation with you all. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Laura. Antes de passarmos às perguntas.
Thank you, Laura. Now let me hand over to our last speaker, Sophie Kosny, with European Council, please.
Bom dia. Good morning to all. I'm very pleased to be here. Like Laura, my last time here to speak about data protection was in 2012, so quite a long time ago. So it's really a pleasure. The previous speakers have all underlined the momentum and the importance of what's being discussed at that time, so I'm very pleased. So I want to thank the organizer, CGI and NIC.br, and in particular Bruno Bioni and his team. They did a fantastic work inviting us and setting up this seminar. Thank you very much for that. So first of all, to start, because seen from thousands of kilometers away from Europe, I think it's very confusing, and I can reassure you it's also very confusing for Europeans themselves, the difference between the Council of Europe and the European Union. So the Council of Europe is a nearly 70 years old organization. It's an international organization, so intergovernmental work, and it's constituted of 47 countries. So geographically, it's much broader than the EU. We have the same flag, we have the same hymn, so indeed it's creating even more confusion, but the organizations are very different in their origins and also in their objectives. The Council of Europe, since 70 years, has been working on human rights, democracy, and rule of law. Those are really the three pillars of the organization that I represent. We are based in Strasbourg in France, and this also doesn't help because there is another EU institution based in Strasbourg, that's the European Parliament. But once again, I highlight the difference. In Strasbourg, one of our institutions of the Council of Europe is the European Court of Human Rights. So really, if I can highlight human rights, it's the core of our business. I've been invited to speak about Convention 108. I know that throughout the world, data protection, most visible and known instrument is often the GDPR, but you will see the articulation between the instruments. The previous speakers have already underlined the importance of Convention 108, and I will in particular come and present the modernization of the Convention. So the Convention is an old instrument. 28 January 1981 was the date of adoption of the instrument. 28 January is now known throughout the world as Data Protection Day, and it's in relation to the adoption, the opening for signature of Convention 108. This instrument is very important increasingly. Previous speakers have referred to the increasing universality of the Convention, and this is how actually it was already conceived in 1981. And we have really to commend the drafters of this instrument because at the time there was no internet, circulation of flows of data which was much more limited than today, and still the drafters already foresaw the need for a global circulation of data. And so even if it's a Council of Europe instrument, since the beginning, they wanted any country in the world to be able to join. It's unique. There is no treaty on data protection at UN level, for instance, open to any country, and influential because we've seen its principles, the core principles of the Convention, have been taken on board on various legislation. Oops. We started the modernization exercise of the Convention to reinforce the individual's protection, because indeed throughout the decades of existence of the Convention, things have evolved, new technologies have emerged, challenges have emerged too. So to reinforce our protection, but also to strengthen the implementation of the Convention. And while doing this, we were very careful to continue to promote it as a universal standard. So basically the language we're using in the Convention, in the modernized versions, continues to be general, simple, and understandable by any region in the world, and to continue maintaining compatibility, consistency, and convergence with frameworks, and in particular, the framework of the EU, for a very simple reason. The EU member states, 28 member states still today, are all members of the Council of Europe, signatories of the Convention, so we needed to ensure consistency between both frameworks. So I feel a bit like all the Brazilian actors involved in the drafting of the law and now finalization, because we started roughly at the same time, the modernization. We started for the 30th anniversary of the Convention, January 2011, and it was just finalized and adopted a few months ago, 18th of May 2018. So you see also a long period, very intense work to manage to come to this result. So I will now present the main aspects of the modernization of the Convention. What I want to say, and it's been said before, is that The core principles that we have in the 1981 text have been repeated. There are some parts of the text that have not been touched at all. For instance, the definition of personal data. And there again, it has to be highlighted. You imagine in 1981, the drafters managed to find a definition that would still be fully valid today. So some parts of the convention were not touched. And I will highlight what I consider the main novelties, and you will see that there are a lot of familiarities between the bill and what is in Convention 108 as modernized. Laura was saying that no, it's not all about data protection, the right to data protection. Data protection is a right that enables the exercise of other rights, and that has been also clearly stated in the modernization of the Convention. You see the role of this right is contributing for the respect to human rights and fundamental rights, so it serves other rights. The article on the scope of the Convention, not new, but I wanted to point it out. The Convention is fully horizontally applicable, both to public and private sectors, so exactly like in your Brazilian bill. This is one of the strengths of the Convention. And we have an exemption for personal or house activities that you also have. Something that is new in the modernization is that there will be a possibility for the committee of the convention to assess, to evaluate, to monitor the enforcement of the convention by the parties. They take an international commitment, they need to respect, and we will be able to assess that in the future. It enhances the credibility of the convention. One key article of the Modernized Convention is Article 5 on the legitimacy and quality of data, and there you will find all the principles applying and conditions applying to the processing. So fairness, lawfulness, legitimacy, proportionality, purpose specification, data minimization, and then the conditions on the quality of data. I just wanted to highlight that indeed now we have the wording about proportionality, fair balance, and in the same article on the legal basis that you need to be able to process data, you will see that unlike the GDPR, unlike the bill in Brazil, we are very condensed. You find in the Modernized Convention textually 2 references, consent, that's the first one, and then another legitimate basis laid down by law, and it's in this general notion that you will find what you have in other legislations, for instance, contracts, legal obligations, public interest, or legitimate interest, or vital interest. This is all covered by this general notion. A key article of the Convention is the article on sensitive data. You also have this in the bill. Those are data that need an enhanced level of protection, so complementary safeguards to everything else that is foreseen in the Convention. And the novelty here with the Modernized Convention is that we have now included genetic data, biometric data uniquely identifying a person, and then the notion of context of the information that will be revealed with the processing of the data. And there, building on the original list that we had, where you had, for instance, health data, data relating to religious beliefs, things that you have in your own bill, we've added also ethnic origin and trade union membership. So those are 2 of the novelties of the modernization. A brand new article of the Modernized Convention is an article on transparency that lists the obligation of the controller. So in this article, you have a very precise list of the information that the controller needs to give to the data subject when data is being processed. And so it's the identity of the controller, it's the contacts where it can be contacted, the legal basis on which the processing is based, the purposes of the processing, categories of data that are being processed, and the means of exercising the rights by the data subject. So those are strict conditions, strict types of information that need to be given, but also the controller has to provide any additional information that would ensure that a fair and transparent processing is carried out. Another key article of the convention that basically has been complemented, it's the article on the rights of the data subject. You will find in this article, Article 9, the rights that already exist. So right of access, right of erasure, right of correction of data, right to remedies. But then I've highlighted in this slide really the novelties of the Modernized Convention that are aimed at responding to algorithmic decision-making, big data era. Those are new rights. So first, the right not to be subject to a decision that significantly affects the data subject, based solely on an automated processing of data without having the views of the persons taken into consideration. The intention was that, for instance, in a profiling processing, there is the human intervention of the data subject that is brought back. And then another novelty, also to respond to challenges posed by algorithmic decision-making and processing, is to obtain on request the knowledge of the reasoning of the processing. That's new. Article 10 of the Modernized Convention contains a lot of novelties and has been presented actually by previous speakers. You will not see the buzzwords accountability, privacy impact assessment, privacy by design, privacy by default in this article, but what you have on the screen is exactly what it corresponds to. So the first bullet is that the controller needs to take all appropriate measures to comply with the obligations, but also to demonstrate this compliance. That's the accountability principle. The controller needs to examine the likely impact prior to beginning the processing and needs to design the processing to prevent or minimize the risk. That's privacy impact assessment, privacy by design, privacy by default, and then needs to take the measures. What is important with this article is that there is a form of scalability. The controller, depending on the volume of data, on the types of data that is processing, will be more or less obliged to follow those provisions. A key part of the convention that has been eagerly discussed, and it's actually one of the explanations of the delays in finding an agreement on the text, is the article on the exceptions to the convention. It's a key article. It follows a logic that we have on the European Convention on Human Rights, is that if you want to be able to bring a derogation to the fundamental rights, first thing, you need a law. It needs to be provided by law. Second thing, it needs to be necessary in a democratic society for particular grounds, and they're all listed on the screen. So when you respond to those conditions, you can derogate. What is fully new with the Modernized Convention is that we have a part of this article, Article 11, that deals specifically with the processing activities for national security and defense purposes. Another key article of the Convention is the article on transborder data flows, and there we see the articulation with the framework of the EU. The principle is that between parties to the Convention, the data must freely flow. There can be exceptions, and I've put them on the screen. And you see the second hyphen is when a party is bound by harmonized rules of protection shared by states belonging to a regional international organization. It may sound like an obscure language, but for instance, it is the case of the parties to the convention that are also member states of the EU. We know it, the EU, with the GDPR, limits the export by EU member states of data. And so those EU member states that are in the convention, they cannot export freely to other parties of the convention. But there are, just like in the GDPR, some other means of exporting data outside to non-parties, and so it's the same means that you find in the GDPR, for instance, contractual binding instruments. Or another possibility is where you have the consent. So there is a list of means that enable transfers of data. Another key element of the modernization is that we have brought in the convention, in the modernized convention, what did not exist in 1981 at all, when the convention was first drafted, the role of the supervisory authorities, so DPAs, and there I've just highlighted one part of the modernization is the importance of the role of cooperation between DPAs, and this is another key aspect of the convention, is that it brings together now 53 countries that are parties, and it facilitates the cooperation between those DPAs. All those countries are facing the same challenges, the same complaints, the same files. They need to be able to work together. What is important to highlight is that the convention sets up a committee that meets in Strasbourg and gathers everybody together. So it's a committee at the moment that gathers 70 countries. That is the 53 parties to the convention, plus the observers. And indeed, I really hope that Brazil will shortly be able to formulate a request to become observer on this committee and participate in the meeting. It would be amongst the 70 countries. We heard Danilo mention 127 countries that have data protection law in the world, the privacy laws. So you see in Strasbourg, it's already over half of those that meet and discuss together data protection. I want in particular to highlight the relationship between the GDPR and Convention 108, and you find it in Recital 105 of the GDPR about transborder data flows, and the fact that when the Commission is assessing the adequacy of a country, it notably takes into consideration the international commitments taken by that country, and in particular, the country's accession to Convention 108, so there is a textual reference to it. Before finishing, I think I missed one key slide, and it's actually not bad to finish with this one. It's the scope of the convention. So here we are. Today there is an asterisk because I've been cheating slightly. This will be legally effective on the 1st of October. On the 1st of October, the convention will count 53 signatories, that is all 47 member states of the Council of Europe, we have them all, plus Cabo Verde and Mexico. Those are the two last ones that have deposited their instruments of accession. And I say, so I've been cheating a bit because today they are not legally bound by the convention. This will enter into force on the 1st of October. So Cabo Verde, Mexico, Mauritius, Senegal, Tunisia, Uruguay. Pending are the countries that have already been invited to join the convention but have not finalized their own internal ratification process. And you see there is Argentina, Burkina Faso, Morocco. Indeed, this convention brings together countries from various continents. As observers also, we have Australia, Canada, Chile, Ghana, Indonesia, Israel, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, USA, and New Zealand. So the word universality, the word global convention is increasingly being used. And as you can see, I've put a question mark for Brazil, once again highlighting the importance, I think, for Brazil to contribute to this work that is being carried out in Strasbourg, to cooperate with peers. And when I say with peers, the richness of the committee is that it's composed both of DPAs. I think half of those 50 countries that are parties have nominated DPAs to participate to the work, and the other half is government representatives. Let me now come back to the latest slide. I wanted to show you, indeed 2018 is a key year for data protection. We've seen it, the GDPR, 25th of May. For us, Council of Europe, on the 18th of May, we had the adoption of the Modernized Convention, hopefully a bill for Brazil this year too. And so on the 25th of May, we issued a new handbook on European data protection law that covers both the EU framework, the GDPR, the directive on police and judicial cooperation, the Modernized Convention, as well as other work we're doing, sectoral work on particular topics, but also all the case law of both courts. The courts in Strasbourg, European Court of Human Rights, and the Court of Luxembourg, which is the Court of the Justice of the European Union. So in this handbook that you can find online on our website, you have basically addressed that non-specialist in data protection, all information, and it's quite a lengthy document for 400 pages. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Muito obrigada.
Merci beaucoup, Sophie. Muito obrigado. Vamos direto.
Let's go straight to the Q&A. We do not have a lot of time. The idea is to close the Q&A session by 12:30, so we have 15 minutes. So let's try and collect perhaps 3 questions and then bring them over to the panel for discussion. We have questions. Do we have questions out there? Good morning. My name is Rubia. I am a lawyer and a professor in digital law. I'd like to congratulate our panel members. And my question is, have you been following internationally discussions about the development of standards for interoperability for applications and new technologies? One of the rights listed is the right of portability of data. Thank you. Any other question from the audience at this point? Good morning. My name is Renata. I come from Barão and from the National Forum for Communication Democratics. I'd like you to please give us some more color on, as it was said, several countries which already have data protection legislation are now choosing to have independent authorities to manage that. I think the flow chart which was shown is quite interesting. It'll help us in our internal debates here in Brazil. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the makeup of those DPAs, those authorities. What kind of public debate has been taking place around the composition of those agencies, authority agencies? And also the challenges in putting those authority agencies together. If you could comment on that, please. Thank you. We have room for one more question, if you have a question out there. In this case, I'll give the floor over to the panel members. So the questions were not made specifically to any of the panel members, so I'd leave them to their discretion to choose who wants to address the questions. Feel free. Let's start with perhaps on the right here with Laura. Okay.
Answer to elaborate a little bit on the interoperability question, which I think is a really important one, as interoperability is a big word, and we talk about interoperability between frameworks, but also between platforms, and we also talk about portability as being an element of being able to move and to take our data with us around, and which is something that has also been enshrined in GDPR and in other mechanisms. When it comes to certainly, I think when it comes to interoperability, I think Bruno said earlier something that is worth repeating. And interoperability doesn't mean copy pasting. When it comes to regimes have to work and have to respond to local, like I was saying before, right? They have to respond to local needs. They have to respond to local culture, to local norms, and to local necessities. And in order to do that, copy pasting is not going to work. But the commonality of values and the shared values across countries is what is going to make interoperability effective. And then just like taking it a little bit further, talking about portability and the enshrined, which has been enshrined in GDPR, and it is taking, it is also being exported to other regimes around the world. I'd invite you to check. We recently posted a hard questions blog about how to make portability effective and what what are the challenges in making portability effective when it comes to assuring, giving people assurances and enabling the right, but also making sure we do it in a secure way. Certainly, and we have a number of external writers that are coming to answer that question and to provide interesting perspectives on how to materialize portability. And I would invite you and be very happy to continue the conversation on that topic.
Okay, thank you, Thiago. Thank you for those questions. I think very briefly on interoperability of the portability right, or rather, listen, I actually think this right has got its place. It's a consumer right. I don't think it is applicable for everything, but it does apply to lots of areas, such as banking. I should have a right to move my bank account with all its data from one bank to another. I should have a right to move my telephone account as well, or perhaps my utilities, energy, gas, water, and so on. I don't think it applies to many other areas, but I think it does apply to that. Interoperability of technologies is a big issue, right? And as somebody who's worked in private sector for many years, every time you want to upgrade your system, every time you want to do something, even to comply with privacy, it's always difficult because systems are old-fashioned, they're legacy, and so on. So I know there is some, some attempts by some tech companies to try to create interoperability so that I can easily port my account from Gmail to Outlook, for example. And I think that's starting to happen. But really, I think we are in very, very early stages. But I certainly think that we do need that. Lots of solutions to some of these issues are technology solutions as well. So that's why I think that's important. I would like to answer your question, if I may, about the makeup of DPAs. There is a very different, globally, there's a very different approach to this. Some DPAs, they first of all vary in sizes, they vary in whether they're a commission or they're a single, one commissioner, one data protection authority, the head of the office. Some have got advisory boards, and I think that's a great model, which I think you also seem to be favoring in Brazil. UK has got that, Singapore has got that. In fact, Singapore has set up a special advisory board for AI as well, artificial intelligence, because the DPAs feel the need to understand more, better technology and work with experts in other fields. And I think that is an important learning point. In fact, knowledge of technology is incredibly critical for the Data Protection Authority. I don't think they should all be lawyers or political scientists. I think you need a mix of talents and skills because the powers of the DPAs and the role is incredibly wide. So you need a very different skill set in the makeup of a DPA. And if that can't be done centrally, if these people can't be employed, then they can be drawn in through various advisory boards. One of the things that we are seeing now is a cooperation between data protection authorities with other regulators. And I think this is something that is very important. Financial services, for example, are particularly interesting. In the UK Financial Conduct Authority has been doing some really innovative regulation making through regulatory sandbox and so on. The UK Privacy Commissioner is very interested to learn from there. And in fact, they're kind of coming at this privacy issue together. The same with utility. In smart meters, smart cities, you're going to see all kinds of data protection issues, and the same with telecom. So it is very important that DPA cooperates with other agencies. So I'll stop there. You can take.
Primeiro questão sobre a...
So the portability and interoperability issue. I would imagine that those issues are one of the most open clauses in the law, and because of that, they are very necessary. The data production law points to the fact that it's no longer about privacy. We have here a seminar about privacy and protection. Those are different things. It's not only about privacy, but when we talk about portability and interoperability, we have other factors coming in, market competition issues, or who owns data or data ownership issue, several aspects that should be accounted for and which goes beyond simply talking about privacy. So Professor Ricardo Abramovich is here, who will tomorrow will address that topic with a broader view about this, going beyond the legal aspects. So the concept of portability involves many more things. So Article 20 and 21 in the law, it talks about the right to review decisions made by automated means. Data protection laws are made to provide rules on aspects of personal data that go beyond privacy. They have to do with the protection of the subject through his or her personal data. Nobody's proposing a specific law, as far as I know. Nobody's proposing a law to or about artificial intelligence, individual protection. Having said that, we need to discuss that more thoroughly. I think it's very important that portability appears as a right in our law, and with an addition, with an amendment, portability as a right, and also in a format that will allow for later access. So we need to include other legal protections. For example, industrial secrecy laws. So we are just in the first steps of that discussion, and in that, we are not very much different from other countries in the world. It's a very complex topic. We talk about, for example, reputational portability, for example. Facebook, which is here with us, have already started taking the first steps in that direction, getting together with other companies, data portability in social media, for example. How far can that go? So there has to be an incentive for mechanisms to be developed with a minimum legal base. Another point about DPAs, we know it's a complex issue as well, but as Bruno Giancarelli mentioned earlier today, when he talked about authorities, he said very interesting and wide-ranging points, and other countries were mentioned here. But when we include UN country members, we're talking about 96 countries, right? With the recent accession of Argelia, for the first time, most UN countries have data protection laws, and out of those, only 16 do not have an independent authority, and those 16 do not include close partners to Brazil. There is also a convergence, which is quite representative for countries where we have independent authorities, autonomous authorities, authorities which are able to meet demands on the data protection front. Bruno has already touched on that, but that is certainly one of the pillars that we need to address as we implement that law in Brazil.
Yes, thank you for the questions. About interoperability, I will only focus on the technical side, not interoperability of legal regimes. You will not see the right to portability in the modernized convention. It's not something that has been introduced in the modernization, but this can also be explained by the fact, indeed, we have a general text open to so many countries. Then at regional level, the EU in the GDPR has safeguarded this right. The articulation between the convention and the GDPR is possible because in the convention, it's an article that allows the signatories to go beyond what we say. And this is exactly the example of the right to portability, for instance, that we do not have in the convention, but that has been laid down at another level. So you will not find it in the convention, but we are working on sectoral text, and at the moment we're working on a text on health-related data. It's a recommendation really specific about the processing of health-related data. And in this work, we have had really lengthy discussions about the need for reference frameworks, technical reference frameworks to facilitate interoperability. And indeed, portability is one of the means to facilitate this interoperability. So this you will find in this text. This is something that the experts have really have underlined as fundamental in that particular field. To come to the questions on DPAs, from a Council of Europe perspective, it's key, it's in our modernized convention, it's an essential element of the regime on data protection and the enforcement. There are indeed multiple models of a DPA, but in the modernized convention, what we consider as the basic criteria and conditions are there. So independence and impartiality in the decision making. There needs to be certain types of powers that are granted to this authority to ensure the enforcement of the law. And it's very broad. Of course, investigating powers, sanctioning powers. There is a role in raising awareness. There is a role also that is in the convention on the role of the DPA in being advising when any piece of legislation that has an impact on the right to data protection, where the piece of legislation that is examined would carry on, would bear upon data processing, then the DPA should be consulted. So those are some of the duties that should be, duties and powers that should be acknowledged for DPAs. So this is a fundamental criteria, and indeed then the other side is that you need to provide them with the necessary means to fulfill those duties, and it's in terms of human resources, expertise, financial resources. So this is all also in the convention for us, Council of Europe, and this is a text that is now agreed by over 50 countries in the world. All those conditions and criteria are essential to the enforcement system of data protection.
Muito obrigado aos palestrantes. Eu apurei eles tanto.
Thank you. I still have 20 seconds, and 20 seconds are enough to thank you all for your attention, thank the panel members, and let you know that we'll be back at 1:45. Let's give a hand to our panel members. Thank you so much.